Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today we're going to do a short video, kind of just an overview of points you might consider while choosing your next gun or your first gun. Primarily going to focus on defensive weapons, home defense, concealed carry. There's other videos that we've done that maybe go into more detail on caliber and some other things. We're going to try to keep this kind of quick, and we may do follow-up videos with much more detail. But to start with, you've got a field of various flavors here of what you might choose for a defensive weapon. You might be picking a new one, the first one that you've ever had, or you might be adding to something that you've already done. But we're going to go on the concept you're going to choose one right now. Whatever you're trying to figure out, you're choosing one. So covering your concealed carry, outside the waistband carry, which is a little bit different, you have more flexibility there, and home defense, general home defense. From a consideration standpoint, one of the first things you would want to consider is caliber. And I know all firearms are able to stop a threat, but the calibers of .380 and above tend to be more effective and more reliable at it. And since there are many good guns in these smaller calibers as well as larger calibers, there's not really a good reason to consider anything smaller than .380. So everything we're going to show you is going to be .380 and up. The next thing to consider is if you have a known preference for a particular style or brand. You may have a preference in general for revolvers, let's say, or a preference in general for Glocks, and not wanting to stray away from the brand, or maybe you hate Glocks. The big thing with that is pick something that you like, something you're going to have confidence in, something that you can trust. But don't let the fanboy or the haters that you see out there on the internet influence you indirectly. If you hear a lot of people saying they hate Glocks, that doesn't mean you have to hate them. But also, if you've got a friend that won't touch anything that's not a Glock without rubber gloves, doesn't mean that a Smith & Wesson or even this little DB9 by Diamondback isn't a good choice for you. A couple other things that may come into play is an age consideration. As you age, some of the capabilities you had when you were 19, you don't necessarily retain. And that may influence you away from something really small that you could easily manage and carry and rack when you were younger. Maybe that capability is not there with you anymore and you want to look at something else. Your eyes, of course, change, and your grip strength, and sometimes over time one of your hands doesn't work as well as the other. So that may influence you in one direction or another. So if your hands are good and strong, you're younger, you can see well, you're looking for a concealed carry, you might be looking in the territory of something like this DB9 by Diamondback. These are fairly inexpensive and they're good high quality, so quality can be had at low prices. Another one that's really popular in that small concealed carry realm is the LCP2 and the LCP2 series in general. And this is a .380 made by Ruger, and this gives you, reasonable power in a small package with manageable recoil. This is a 9mm. It's going to have more recoil, but it's a similarly small package. So this may be the territory you're looking at as your first one, where you can use these as concealed carry, and you can also use them for home defense. But when you get into home defense, you have a little bit more room that you can carry something larger like a Glock 19 or the various variants in that realm. These are kind of considered to be the standard for concealed carry, home defense, kind of general do-it-all type things. This might be a good choice, but you're going to have a hard time throwing something like this in your pocket. This particular one's in 9mm, but they also make a variation of this in .40. So mentioning that, let's talk about caliber a little bit, and I talked about it briefly. .380 being the minimum caliber, in our opinion, that is an effective caliber, generally gets you small and concealable. You also may find that .380 in a larger gun gives you a very easy to rack slide. So we mentioned earlier, strength can come into play. If you can't rack a slide easily, this Smith & Wesson M&P 380 EZ, Shield EZ, comes in .380 and is really easy to rack, really easy to work with. It's relatively light, it's a little bit bigger, but this could kind of cover the bases across both of them, and you get a full 3-finger grip on it. So that's the other thing. Your hand size and your grip strength can come into play. If you've got powerful hands, you can pretty much hold anything you want to. If you have more issues with your hands, having a gun that only gets 1 or 2 fingers on the grip may not work well for you. Something like this can be very difficult to control when you're only getting 1.5 fingers on it, maybe 2 fingers if it's got a magazine little finger extension. So the hand size and the grip strength can come into play. A lot of times you'll find if you've got extra large hands or very small hands, it's going to influence what works well for you. So in that case, one of the points we're going to make is I don't care what you pick from this field or anything else, make sure you go handle one. Make sure that you can grip it comfortably, that you can put your finger on the trigger comfortably, that you can see the sights. You know, Glocks have the U-dot sights, which a lot of people love to hate, but they're actually quite easy to see. And other guns, like this LCP, have virtually non-existent sights. So trying to shoot this at distance in a hurry is not going to be easy. This is more of a get-off-me size gun. But in that same size territory, this Diamondback has sights every bit as good as the Glock. So just because the gun is small doesn't mean it's going to have bad sights. But that comes into play. That can also be influenced by your vision. If you've got really good eyes, you might be able to see those black-on-black sights. If not, you may even want something like a red dot. If I can get the dot to appear. Now, of course, red dots don't show up good on camera. They're not usually big and blurry like that. In reality, this is a nice fine point dot. Something like this can make it easier for you to get your target and without having to really see sights. The thing you want to consider if you choose any sort of augmentation like that is, especially like a laser, is make sure that you can use the gun without the laser or the red dot. Make sure that you practice with being able to use it without that in case it fails. But the fact that a laser battery can go dead is not a good reason not to use a laser. It's just make sure you do both. But if you've got eyesight problems, those types of things can make it much easier to acquire a target when you need to. Now, if you're looking at a carry gun, one thing that's going to come into play is your carry style preference. If you're carrying in the pocket, ankle, things like that, you're definitely going to want to bias towards something smaller. The single stacks typically. If you're not looking at having the smallest thing, you might then move up to something like in a subcompact. This can be carried inside the waistband or in a pocket. They're double stack. You generally have a little more capacity. Capacity is always a trade-off. This particular one is a Glock 27 and 40. There's another variant of this. It's almost identical. It's a 26 and it's a 9mm. This is a little unpleasant to shoot. The 40 in a small gun like this is unpleasant to shoot. When you get 40 in a larger gun, it can be easier to shoot. Something like this is definitely out of the pocket realm. So now you're back to a Glock 19, and there's other variations, the PPQ and other guns that are in this similar size territory, M&P Shield. This one's 9mm. You can get this basic format in 357 SIG and 40. These tend to be now inside the waistband or outside the waistband. You're not going to put this on your ankle, and you're really out of the pocket realm at this point. And then as you move up and you decide we're going to go really big inside the waistband, I've got a 1911 here, and of course this is a hammer gun, and we do have a video on choosing hammer versus striker. This particular one happens to be in 10mm. They're commonly in 45, and they can also be had in 9mm. They're heavier, they're steel, they really absorb recoil well, but they're big, so they're starting to limit you. And then you can get into the competition size guns. This is a Glock 40. This one's in 10mm. There's probably not much this couldn't deal with, but they're big, they're bulky. Really now, inside the waistband's not even an option anymore. This is definitely an outside the waistband gun. Inside the waistband, you probably wouldn't be able to sit down with the thing. It'd hit the ground before you do. So kind of what you're going to do with it does influence your choices a little bit. As a general rule, the smallest ones can do all of the things, and as you get into the bigger ones, you're limited to a particular area of it. Recoil is another consideration. All of the smaller guns, regardless of caliber, tend to be a bit on the snappy side. They tend to recoil a little bit aggressively, and they tend to not handle recoil well, even if you're looking at little revolvers. This one's got a 2-finger grip. Now this does have a rubber grip, so that absorbs recoil to some extent. But when you get into these little ones, they're a little bit snappy. As you move up, you get something like this size. Depending on the caliber, this can actually be quite comfortable and easy to control. 40 is not the best choice for that, but as you move up, you tend to get better recoil management. Something like this in 9mm is going to have very, very little felt recoil. So if recoil sensitivity is a thing, larger revolvers over smaller revolvers, larger guns, semi-automatics over smaller semi-automatics, And that's a consideration too in general. Do you prefer a revolver, the operating mechanism of a revolver? And don't get hung up on the hype that revolvers never fail and semi-automatics aren't reliable. Really, in modern guns, good quality guns, that's not true. Revolvers can fail, but they're simpler, so there's fewer things to go wrong. And most modern semi-automatics are as reliable as anything else, and they work quite well. And one also consideration comes into play that may come in. If you take this size gun, the Glock, there's a 40 version of this, and this is an XDM that also is available in 40 and 9. The XDM, this particular one is a 40. The XDM handles recoil of the 40 better than the Glocks do. Whether it has to do with the grip angle, the design of the gun, the weight, whatever it is, if you're looking at 40, which tends to have an unpleasant recoil, the XDMs do a little bit better job of it than the Glocks. Both are reliable and both function well. And when you look at hammer guns, you're not restricted to just 1911s. There's a number of variations out there in the hammer guns. These, even with the open barrel, are kind of cool to look at. They're proven reliable, just like the 1911. So you don't necessarily have to get stuck to a particular style. There's a lot of diversity out there available to you. Now, budget comes into play. A lot of these hammer guns are nice to look at, the 1911, this one, but they tend to be in the 800 up category. The revolvers have a wide spread where these can be had under 300 or in the 300 territory if you shop well, but you can also pay 500 plus for them. The bigger stainless revolvers like this tend to be, 500 and up, get into the 700-800 territory. And one note on the hammer guns, there's a lot of polymer hammer guns out there now that can be had in the 3 to 5 territory. So the bigger, service weapon, heavy metal ones tend to be a little more expensive, but that operating mechanism is available reasonably. These little guns can be had anywhere in the sub 200, sub 300 territory and on up. You can get a Carp PM9 or a P380 that is in the 700, 6 to 700 territory. So budget's going to influence you. Glocks and the XDMs tend to be in the 5 to 600 territory depending on where you get them. Do your research. Look at online. Look to see if the manufacturer has a good track record. How do they handle recalls? It's less important how many recalls they have as to how they handle them. Do they play games? Do they try to mess around? Or do they just own up to when there's an issue? Ruger really does a good job of that. If there's a little issue, however small, they issue something to get it fixed. They aggressively work on it. Other guns like Glock, Walther, if you take like the Walther PPQ, they have a really proven track record. There's other manufacturers you may not know as much about, like FN, that make really high quality guns, but you aren't going to hear the buzz about them. You're always going to hear about Glocks. Whether somebody hates them or loves them, they just tend to work. That's true of these too. Here's an FN 509. They make a number of them in that area. They also are quite reliable. So do your research on the brand, but don't try to avoid paying too much attention to the fanboys and the haters. They don't give you accurate, unbiased information. Look, there's a lot of good YouTube channels out there. We've got videos on most guns that you might want to look at, and there are many other good channels. Try to determine whether or not they're buying their guns or whether they're getting given free factory samples that have been hand-picked. That may influence things a little bit. In the end, take all of that information that you've got, try to get a consensus of it, and use that to help make your decision. Friends are also a good source of information, but keep in mind they may be biased. You might have that friend that thinks that anything other than a Glock is junk. Well, he'll give you good information about Glocks, but he's not going to give you good information about a Smith & Wesson. One other consideration is not all guns of a particular size are the same. So you take this new Mossberg MC1 and this new Hellcat. And by the way, new guns can be just as good as older designs, or can be worse depending on the gun. This one here, the MC1, it's a 9mm, and it's basically the same size as the Glock 43. It even uses Glock 43 mags. This is actually easier to shoot well than a stock Glock 43. The way the trigger's set up, and trigger really can play a difference in how the trigger feel, if it's too heavy, if it's too light, if it's mushy, can affect your ability to shoot it well. A stock Glock 43 is harder to shoot well than this. You modify the trigger on a Glock 43 and they become equal again. So just because these guns share magazines interchangeability and size interchangeability doesn't mean they're necessarily equal. So if you get to the range and try a gun, then you may find that you like or dislike something. With revolvers, one thing to look at is you have these hammerless style revolvers that tend to be small and light and they don't snag. They tend to have moderate triggers. This one's actually got a fairly decent trigger, but it's a little heavy and it's a little bit long. When you get into revolvers with an exposed hammer, often cases you can thumb the hammer back, and that gives you a short trigger. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility in the trigger, but you do have to take, in that case, the extra time to thumb it back to get that light trigger, or you can pull the trigger. Don't go too light. Something like a PPQ's got an awesome trigger, but it's really short and it's really light, and somebody that's new might have a hard time with shooting when they don't want to. So the trigger can affect it. Getting some range time with a buddy that owns one, a rental range, things like that, once you've kind of narrowed the field down to a few of them, can make a big difference in making sure you pick something that in the end you'll like. These days there's a whole lot out there. As you went back a little bit in time, you had fewer and fewer choices. Now there's a huge field of things to pick from. So there's really not a good reason that you get stuck with something you don't like. The only other thing we didn't talk about, and we'll probably do a more detailed video on it, is left-handed. If you're a left-handed shooter versus a right-handed shooter. Some guns are ambidextrous, where the controls are on both sides. The magazine release, like a paddle-style release that can be operated with either finger, gives you a little more flexibility. Whereas many guns, this is a Walther PPQ, this particular one's in 9mm, and it's also easy to take down. It's easy to get a hold of the takedown mechanism on it. Versus something like the Glocks, which the takedown mechanism is easy to use, but it's a little harder to get a hold of if you have difficult hands. The mag release is only on one side, but it is reversible. So we'll do a more robust video on left hand versus right hand to kind of help narrow that field down for somebody. And one last thing, I talked about budget. I forgot to mention price shop. Different stores are going to have different pricing. Some guns like Glocks tend to be the same price roughly everywhere. Others, like this little LCRs, can vary wildly. So price shop your local stores, price shop online. Don't necessarily figure just because you see it in one store for $500 means that this is always going to be a $500 gun. There's a lot of opportunity out there. Buying online's easy, and you just have to factor in the fact that you're going to pay the transfer fee. But other than that, you can get good deals fairly easily if you just look around. Beyond that, if you like our videos, give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, click that bell to be notified if you do. Check us out on Gunstreamer, Patreon, Twitter, Instagram, kind of spreading out a little bit. And have a great day. Thank you.